I'm going to talk about the regulatory updates, specifically the stage 13 regulatory updates to the Contaminated Sites Regulation. I will very briefly touch on the stage 14 regulatory updates at the very end of a presentation, which are ones that the ministry has told us are coming now, and have started to put the pieces in place, but it's still a little early for those to be their own presentation. But that will undoubtedly be a presentation I will be giving in the coming months once I'm sure what those changes are going to look like. My name is Tad Berger. I am the Operations Manager and Regional Practice Leader at Pinchin. I am a Contaminated Sites approved professional with over 23 years experience in the field of contaminated sites. And I am one of the experts at Pinchin and in the BC regulations. Pinchin is a national company throughout British Columbia, throughout all of Canada, about 900 staff and 40 offices. We're just hitting our 40th year of existence as a company, and we provide a full range of environmental services for anybody who could use anything that we might be able to provide support on. Today's focus, however, will be just on the environmental due diligence field that we provide, and specifically for contaminated site regulations and implications of some of those changes. We are going to talk about Schedule 2 and what that is and what that means and what's changed. We're going to talk about site profiles and their conversion over to site disclosure statement and those impacts. We're going to focus quite a bit of time on looking at the triggers for when a site disclosure statement is required, and what that means and what that's going to do to projects you might have planned or activities that are currently ongoing on your properties. We're going to look at some of the new requirements for reporting and providing reports to the Ministry of Environment. And then we'll finally end with changes that are coming, still in the works and coming through the regulatory system. So what happened? In 2019, Bill 17 was passed. Bill 17 made changes to the Environmental Management Act, and it also made some subsequent changes to the Island Trust Act, Land Title Act, Local Government Act, Vancouver Charter, Oil and Gas Activities Act, and Property Law Act. And all of those additional acts were changed in order to empower the Environmental Management Act and allow some of the changes that were being made to that act. When those were all changed, there was a stipulation in that change that none of the changes would go into effect until an order of council was issued that specified a date in which those changes would go into effect. And that was because regulatory updates were also required in order to allow for some of those changes in the act to make sense. So in 2020, Order in Council 368 was passed. It made a number of significant changes to the Contaminated Sites Regulation, and it set into effect all of the changes to both Bill 17 and Order in Council 368 to go into effect February 1st, 2021, which is now 3.5 weeks ago. So everything that I'm talking about here is now gone into effect. The Ministry of Environment does not believe in setting rules up with much in the way of grandfathering. It's their position that it really can only have one set of regulations apply at a time. And so with only a few limitations, which I'll talk to briefly through this presentation, the new rules are what's in effect, and anything going forward need to be applied against those new rules, and any leniences or bypasses under the old rules may not have influence anymore. That said, for very clear clarity, legal instruments, certificates of compliances, final determinations are still good. Old ones are still good. The rules did not make a change that would have impacted the validity of those legal instruments. So those are all still in place if you have those, but other kinds of bypasses may not be still able to hold. So Of the changes, one of the most significant was the changes to Schedule 2. And really, I think is the largest wholesale change to the Schedule 2 that we've seen since the regulation came out about 23 years ago. And this Schedule 2 is a list in the Contaminated Site Regulation. It's obviously Schedule 2 of a Contaminated Site Regulation, listing activities that the ministry refers to as specified industrial commercial uses. And anything on this list, regardless of whether or not it has actually caused contamination, will trigger additional requirements to do further investigation and in most cases eventually obtain a legal instrument for a property. And so that's approval in principle, certificate of compliance, final determinations. And so if you have an activity on your site that's on this list or historical activity on the site that is on this list, then there are going to be triggers. And I'm going to I've got several slides that are going to talk to those triggers and what exactly those triggers mean. But first, want to focus on understanding what is on this list of activities. So one of the first most notable changes is reportable spills. Any site that has had a spill with a volume requiring it to be a reportable spill that property now is a Schedule 2 activity. So that's significant because there are a number of properties that otherwise wouldn't have Schedule 2 activities. A good example of a project I worked on a few years back was a shopping mall, all retail, no other issues in that shopping mall. However, somebody thought it would be a great idea to vandalize a car, and by vandalizing that car, poke a hole in its gas tank. And all the fuel in that vehicle's gas tank emptied out onto the ground, went into a storm basin, was mostly captured by oil water separators. Pinchin came out, we recovered all the fuel, we did some verification sampling to make sure that nothing had gone through the asphalt, and we were done. And said the site's clean, nothing got through the asphalt, everything was captured and recovered and not a problem. And that would have been the end of what was necessary at that site. However, now because the spill is a reportable spill, that site now has had a Schedule 2 activity on it. And so all the triggers that I'll speak to later will all apply to that site equally. And that site will now require at some point in time more investigation and eventually a legal instrument. Another notable change is sandblasting. Sandblasting grit and disposal of that grit waste has always been a Schedule 2 activity, but sandblasting is now a Schedule 2 activity. So that may mean that you've got a facility that does some sandblasting indoors within a contained area, and that doesn't matter if that's all contained and it isn't going to cause contamination. There's going to be legal obligations to do more assessment of that now in the future. Another change is paint manufacturing, bulk storage has always been on Schedule 2, but they added shipping and handling, and they specifically excluded retail. So your Color Your World or Sherwin-Williams retail facility for paint stores, that's not a Schedule 2 activity. However, your paint booth is very likely going to be a Schedule 2 activity. And we see these paint booths in a lot of industrial properties. They're almost always built as having internal secondary containment, and they're built inside the building. So they're built over concrete floors, and the paint containment containers are often quite small. And so really they don't tend to have a real potential to cause contamination in many, many cases. There are cases where they could cause, but in many cases they don't. But that's still going to push them forward now as requiring further investigation in many instances and to meet certain regulatory triggers. They actually added shipping and handling to a lot of the definitions, and the Ministry of Environment has chosen not to define what shipping and handling means. I have posed a number of pointed questions to try and get some level of understanding. I started with saying, okay, well, I'm talking to you on my computer. My computer is electronic shipping and they've added shipping and handling to electronics, have electrical equipment. So is that count? And they said, no. I said, okay, well, how about an Apple store? They said, no, they do not intend shipping and handling to include retail level. I said, okay, well, what about a warehouse? They said, it depends on how much electronics is coming through that warehouse as to whether or not it would be shipping and handling. So warehouse for something like Best Buy probably would spark the requirements. But the ministry was not either able or willing to provide me with a specific level as to where exactly that limit is, which makes it difficult as a consultant to provide clear advice when a property is right near that level as to whether or not it sparks a Schedule 2 activity, and will likely result in many cases consultants such as myself reaching out to the ministry on a site-by-site and case-by-case basis and asking them, does this spark the requirement or not? A piece of really, really good news is a change to above ground, underground storage tanks. They have put in an exemption saying that tanks with secondary containment, so your double-walled tanks or ones with built intrinsic built containment around them, do not spark the Schedule 2 activity. And so it's a number of properties where they might have, for some reason, a waste oil tank, but no other Schedule 2 activities, and that would have sparked further requirements. And now it wouldn't, because if that waste oil tank was double walled, it wouldn't be a Schedule 2 activity as well either. So this will pull some properties that historically would have been considered to have Schedule 2, no longer would consider. Another really important change is rail spurs. Rail spurs historically, any rail line would have been a Schedule 2 activity at some point by default. The ministry had actually had a guidance spelling that out quite clearly. They have rescinded that guidance and they modified a number of the Schedule 2 activities around rail yards, such that a rail yard itself does not, or not a rail yard, sorry, a rail spur itself does not automatically constitute a Schedule 2 activity requiring further investigation. That said, a lot of activities that happen on a rail yard would fall into the shipping and handling category that have been added to a number of activities. So the rail spur may not be a Schedule 2, but the shipping and handling of what the rail spur was bringing onto the site may be a Schedule 2. So it will not provide relief in all cases of rail spurs, but it will provide relief in a number of cases of rail spurs. Some other common Schedule 2 activities: paint manufacturing, I talked to that one, bulk storage, shipping and handling, battery manufacturing, recycling, bulk storage. And again, this one they added shipping and handling. And I know of some warehouses that have quite a number of batteries associated with their forklift operations and battery recharge stations, and 3 or 4 sets of batteries per forklift with dozens of forklifts. And the question becomes, does that level of batteries handling count as shipping and handling? And to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. That it will be something that I will be seeking more guidance from a ministry when I have a specific instance of that, to see if it sparks a requirement. I'm of a belief that the ministry will take a reasonable point of view in the interpretation for something like that. Ministry's been quite good in BC about being reasonable in its interpretations. But they need to also be consistent in their interpretation. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Welding and machine shops. This is a common one that I see in commercial industrial properties that are spark Schedule 2. There's not really been a change here, but I wanted to make sure people were aware of that welding machine shops. And that doesn't mean welding machine shops on the first floor. You can have them on the second floor, have multiple levels of underground parking below. The mere presence of these activities means Schedule 2 and pulls you in. Appliance engine repair, and I note appliances in there, not just engine repair, cleaning, salvage. So if a site's activity is a repair toaster ovens, that is still a Schedule 2 activity, because toaster ovens would be appliances. One that catches people by surprise, in medical, chemical, and biological laboratories. And so you can have a 5-story building. It's a doctor's all doctor's offices, and on the 3rd floor of that building is a laboratory that does blood work and blood and urine samples. That would be a Schedule 2 activity. That would spark requirements for further investigation. And to be honest, I don't even know what I would be investigating in those instances. In many cases, it'd be acetone and potentially some types of alcohols or such that they're using. It would be dependent on that specific facility and what reagents they're using. But it would be a Schedule 2 activity that would require further investigation, even though there's really not a likelihood of contamination. So you can get Schedule 2 activity on Schedule 2 does not mean the site's contaminated or the site's even likely to be contaminated. It means that there's a requirement to do more. And just as there are activities that will cause contamination and properties that are absolutely contaminated that aren't on Schedule 2 and probably still need more, but not necessarily through the same regulatory process.
Tad, before we move on, we have a quick question from a participant on the note of laboratories.
Yes.
Does lab activity apply to hospital labs where specimens are reviewed?
Hospital labs absolutely are considered laboratories. I've specifically had that question to the Ministry of Environment more than once and continually get the same answer. And I am working on multiple hospital projects where their laboratory is the primary driver of a requirement to do more. Yes. And again, I don't think that those laboratories are actual sources of contamination, but direct regulations require me to prove it. Some other common activities, dry cleaners. Dry cleaners are bad, always bad. But even our green dry cleaners, the quote unquote green dry cleaner, maybe it's using a new solvent, or maybe it's using no solvent. A dry cleaner is a dry cleaner. The regulation does not specify dry cleaners using PERC. It says dry cleaners. And so regardless of the type of dry cleaner, it would spark further environmental requirements. Sites that have been contaminated by their neighbors require more. Spills, as I mentioned, above ground and underground storage tanks, vehicle repair, dry docks, marina, and boat repair. What's interesting in this one is they've added the word marinas to the Schedule 2 activity, but they've not defined what a marina is. And so any property that is got waterfront, that's got multiple boats, if that is being defined by somebody as a marina, then even if there's no boat refueling, boats repair, anything like that, it may spark the requirement for further investigation. And then you're doing investigation out over the water, collecting sediment samples. And you can imagine that that's expensive for chasing something that's probably not really a concern in a lot of cases. And then sandblasting, that I already previously mentioned. Okay, now that we've kind of got an understanding of Schedule 2 activities, I'm going to move on to site profiles. And specifically that site profiles no longer exist. They've been renamed to site disclosure statements. And this is a quick look at the site disclosure statement. It's really just who owns the property, where it's the address of property, legal information about the property, and is there a Schedule 2 activity? And the site profile, which no longer exists, the site disclosure statement is really just a shorter version of site profile. And it's bad that it's shorter in my mind, because what they've done is they've taken away a bunch of yes or no questions that used to be on a site profile. It used to be that you needed to have a Schedule 2 activity and answer yes to one of these questions in order for there to be a regulatory freeze on a property. And by taking away the yes or no questions, it means that every single property that has a Schedule 2 activity, either current or historical, is automatically going to get a freeze. And what that means by freeze is at a trigger point, copy of the site profile goes to the Ministry of Environment. The Ministry of Environment then sends a letter to the municipality that says, "Dear municipality, you may not issue the permit being requested." until such time as we've been satisfied. And it's a whole process to satisfy the ministry to remove that freeze. And I'll talk more about those freeze removals, but it's a whole process to remove those freeze, to be able to do the redevelopments, rebuilding, additions to your sites. And so it's really going to have an impact in slowing down and making more complicated and making more expensive any kind of redevelopment on a property, which is also going to affect the prices of property, because any property best use may be affected by its ability to redevelop, because there are regulatory freezes, or will be regulatory freezes on the property. It's also worth noting that under the old site profile process, there were about 36 municipalities that simply opted out of the process. They just didn't want to do it, and they weren't going to do it. And those were municipalities spread out throughout British Columbia. And the Ministry of Environment has eliminated municipalities' ability to opt out of a process. So this is now something that all municipalities are legally obligated to do and complete. And so a lot of neighborhoods and small towns where this process kind of was skipped are going to suddenly find that they've got properties that have been redeveloped and issues were resolved, and now on a redevelopment, it's being tagged, and you've got to kind of go backwards through the process, and will cause some confusion and delay on quite a number of properties in some of these municipalities. So when do you need to submit a site disclosure statement? What are the triggers? Well, there's good news. We'll start with the good news on that. The good news is that zoning, which was always a trigger, is now only sometimes a trigger. If there's a zoning change in which the Schedule 2 activity can still take place on the property, then it isn't a trigger. It doesn't actually have to still be taking place. It just has to be allowed to still take place. So for instance, if you've got a gas station and you're looking to do some rezoning to allow a drive-through in that gas station, there won't be a trigger there. If you've got a property that was a gas station historically and you're rezoning it to be restaurants only and gas stations wouldn't be allowed in that zoning, then it would still trigger. Development permit variances are no longer triggers. Soil removal permits are no longer triggers. If you've submitted a site profile and that site profile answered no to all the questions, then you're grandfathered and don't need to resubmit a site disclosure statement. Though that doesn't really have a whole lot of help, because that site disclosure statement would have had no schedule, well, actually it does help in some instances where there's Schedule 2 activities. So some properties will get grandfathered in where they've got a Schedule 2 but answered no. If they answered yes and got a temporary and got a permission not to freeze the property, those properties are going to find themselves in a fair amount of confusion, because that site profile wouldn't grandfather them against a site disclosure statement. The final key exemption is for what the ministry refers to as minor works. And so that is utility permits for utilities, for fencing, for landscaping, for demolition, for paving, or any permits for activities that aren't going to move soil. So if you're getting a building permit to do the facade of a building, all of those sorts of things would not spark a site disclosure statement, which simplifies for a number of properties doing small level work. A reminder, and this actually isn't really a change, a reminder for people doing buying and selling property, there is a requirement for a site disclosure statement to be provided to a purchaser. Does not go to the Ministry of Environment, it just goes from the seller to the purchaser, where there was a property with a known Schedule 2 activity, either current or historical. There is a requirement to provide that. Now, a vendor can put into the contract wording to get the purchaser to agree that they don't need a site disclosure statement, but and a lot of brokers do that. They add language saying that no site profile or site disclosure statement is required, and then you can bypass that step if that's agreed to by both parties. But if it's not, then there's Schedule 2. There is a legal requirement for a seller to provide a site disclosure statement to a buyer. Okay, so the bad news on triggers. Development permits are triggers. Always been triggers, no change there. So it's not terrible news, but it's that's still a trigger. Big change is building permits. Building permits are now a trigger to the site disclosure statement and are a permit that can get frozen through the process. This is really significant in a number of municipalities. There were some municipalities that simply didn't have development permits and went straight to building permits, and they were bypassing the regulations entirely that way, and that bypass no longer exists. There are some municipalities that in industrial areas wouldn't require development permits, and you would have gone right to building permits. And again, that's why the ministry changes, because there were a lot of properties that were bypassing the process. And so now building permits are a trigger that would require further investigation and an assessment, and or minimally a site disclosure statement submittal. Ceasing operations or decommissioning. And decommissioning was there before, but ceasing operations is a big change to that definition. So if you've got an activity on a property that is a Schedule 2 activity and you eliminate that activity, there is a requirement to submit a site disclosure statement. Okay, so for instance, if you've got a warehouse and in that warehouse, you have a section of that warehouse where you've got a welding shop, and you decide to shut down that welding shop, you don't need it anymore, and you're just going to, use the rest of that property for warehousing. When you shut down that welding shop, there's now a requirement to notify the Ministry of Environment, and you've got 1 year to provide. Cessation of operations means that it stopped for a year. So you've got a year to provide that site disclosure statement. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about some other things that will get triggered at that point. These last 3 bullets are really about various kinds of insolvencies. If you're filing under a Creditor Agreement Act, if you're filing under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, or if you're implementing foreclosure proceedings for the benefit of a creditor, and in each of those instances, there is a requirement to submit a site disclosure statement to the Ministry of Environment. And so, yeah, so anybody taking any of those steps have a requirement to notify the Ministry of Environment. And again, there'll be some, next slide, we'll talk about some additional requirements above and beyond that. Which brings me to that next slide. So we have the ugly on the site disclosure statement triggers. The first is something I've briefly mentioned before: development permits and building permits, which trigger a site disclosure statement, are going to result in a freeze. The property will be frozen until you've done investigation and you've gotten a release, either through the freeze release process, or the ministry's preference would be through the obtaining of a legal instrument. And that is either an approval in principle and or a certificate of compliance and final determination. And those are, as people probably aware, expensive propositions and time-consuming propositions. So a lot more properties are going to require legal instruments under these new requirements. It's really going to result in a lot more work for the consulting world. In addition to the site disclosure statement, when you're doing a decommissioning cessation of operations, or you're commencing legal proceedings to take possession of a property for a creditor, there is a requirement to do a stage 1, stage 2, and detailed site investigation, and you have to do that within a year of submitting the site disclosure statement. And so what that means is you need to do that investigation. So you've got, as an example, you've got a building, it's got that medical lab on the 3rd floor, and that medical lab's not likely to cause any contamination, but the medical lab's closing and it's leaving the property, and doctors' offices are going to fill the space instead. That is a cessation of operations of a Schedule 2 activity, and it's of a last Schedule 2 activity, which is an important point. And so there's now a requirement to submit a site disclosure statement and to conduct a stage 1 and stage 2 at that property. And inquiring at the Ministry of Environment, kind of threw out a few examples and said, okay, well, what if I do a stage 1 and I determine there's no potential of contamination? Am I done? And they've said, no, you need to do a stage 2. The regulation says stage 1 and stage 2. You need to do that further investigation. And the only piece of good news there is you don't actually provide those reports to the Ministry of Environment. What you provide is a risk classification report to the Ministry of Environment that states that those investigations have been completed and qualifies the risk level as either a high-risk site or not a high-risk site for the property. Anything that's a not high-risk site likely wouldn't need anything more until the time of another trigger occurring and a freeze. A site that is a high-risk site, the Ministry of Environment is going to issue a letter requesting more information and a schedule for site investigation and cleanup. So when you think about all these properties with their that were gas stations and are sitting vacant, and those properties are now, when those properties first vacate, now have an obligation to at least do some investigation right away and provide some of that information to the Ministry of Environment. So in those cases, I think that's a really good thing, but it's really going to add a lot of burden. There's going to be a lot of property managers who are operating strip malls or commercial, other kinds of commercial or light industrial properties that have Schedule 2 activities that they're not even aware of, and are going to have those tenants leave and be out of compliance with the regulation, in many cases without even realizing it. And that is going to create liability for property owners in a potentially significant way. This last bullet here, if you are going under a Creditor Agreement Act or Bankruptcy Insolvency Act, obviously there's a lack of funds, and so the Ministry of Environment is not asking for further investigation in those cases, but they're asking for copies of any investigations that are less than 5 years old to be provided to the Ministry of Environment, and they will actually review those documents to determine whether or not they need anything more at that time. If no documents exist, then there's nothing to provide them. But they're not seeking further work, because obviously there's not the funds to do further work immediately. In the changes to the regulations, they added quite a number of references to the criminal code, and did that to make sure that these regulations add teeth and enforceable teeth. My understanding is that they are able to issue fines on a daily basis that you were out of compliance. I honestly was not able to follow the links through the criminal code and understand what I'm doing. I think I'd need a law degree for that. But my understanding from some early conversations with ministry folk is that they may be able to fine as much as $75,000 a day for people who are out of compliance. Now, the good news again on that is that we've got a very reasonable Ministry of Environment. My experience with them is if people are out of compliance, but they are trying, they don't look to penalize those people. They look to help and support those people. But if the ministry feels that you are intentionally being non-compliant, they do have $75,000 a day being non-compliant for submitting a site disclosure statement or investigation results is some fairly sizable teeth to that they could implement. And at those kinds of rates, they could afford to hire some people to help them with the enforcement of it. Nearing the end, we talked a little bit about freezes and freeze releases. One of the changes the ministry has made is to administrative guidance number 6. They actually deleted that administrative guidance and they moved it to their website. So it's an even looser form than it had been before. They have eliminated the no site investigation request. And so that was something I used with great success on a number of projects where there was a Schedule 2 activity and maybe even some yes answers, but there really wasn't a potential for contamination. So for instance, a property had a auto repair that operated on the site for 9 months, and that was it. And it was over It was over 2 levels of underground parking, all that vehicle repair activities, all the chemical storage was inside. So really wasn't a mechanism for contamination to occur. A proper due diligence phase 1 is going to say no further investigation. And I reached out to the ministry and said, hey, I've done a little bit of investigation. The site's clean. There's no mechanism for contamination. This site doesn't need more. And the ministry would say, yes, great, done, and wouldn't put a freeze on the property. And they've eliminated our ability to do that. That property would now get a freeze. It would now eventually need a final determination that states that property is clean. They've eliminated, there were, under Administrative Guidance 6, there were 5 ways to temporarily remove a freeze. They've removed number 1 and number 3. They have limited number 2, and they have limited number 4 and 5. So there are now only 3 options, and they've much more limited them. And the ministry's made it clear that their preference is for properties to get an approval in principle and not a freeze release. And approval in principles take longer and are far more expensive proposition to obtain. And so it really has the potential to cause delays on development, and really means that you need to get your environmental work and environmental assessments and environmental releases much earlier in the process. It can't be done weeks before you're breaking ground. It needs to be done months and sometimes quarters before, multiple quarters before breaking down. Otherwise, you may find breaking ground. Otherwise, you may find that your permits are locked up and you're not actually able to hit your development targets. The last slide here for everyone. What's coming? Okay, well, the ministry has released quite a few guidance documents and modified guidance documents based on Administrative Guidance 13. I still have quite a number of questions, and we'll be seeking more guidance on exactly some of the definitions. I'm hopeful that the ministry is going to see these questions coming from myself and from other consultants and provide a little bit more guidance, but I don't expect that to happen in the immediate term. We know that stage 14 amendments are coming. The Ministry of Environment has released its intention paper. You can find that on the land remediation website. The intentions paper for the stage 14 amendments. Stage 14 amendments are a complete revisioning on management of soil that are leaving a property. It's going to include such things, especially for property to Schedule 2 activities, as having to notify First Nations from a property in which soil is being removed and from a property in which soil is being received. And at that receiving property, I believe now will get added to the site registry. It's going to have limitations on properties that bring in more than 200,000, I believe, cubic meter, or 20,000. Can't remember the number, apologies, cubic meters of soil, and mean that one property that brings it in, the neighboring properties may not be able to bring in some of that soil. There's specification and limitations on some of that, but it'll really affect the ability to move soil, what soil can be moved where, and really result in any property that has a Schedule 2 activity finding it more expensive to move clean soil during development because there'll be additional notification requirements. There'll be delays. You've got to notify the First Nation 2 weeks before, which means that you can't have a last minute change as to where soil might be being shipped to, even if it's clean. And so it's really going to cause, if you're a developer or work in an area where you've got a lot of soil movement happening, then I'm going to strongly recommend that you read the intentions paper. You've got till, I believe, March 15th to provide feedback. I know some of the feedback the ministry has been getting is things that they're going to need to make changes for. For instance, quarries are Schedule 2 activities, and quarries' whole business are pulling soil material out of them. And so the rules don't work for quarries, because how do they notify every time material is coming from them? Any other property that has a lot of throughput of soil may have those same sorts of issues. So if you've got a property it's going to have a lot of soil movement, reading the intentions paper, and the ministry has been giving some webinars on it. The information on the intention paper and on their webinars don't seem to be matching 100%, which explains the ministry is still trying to sort through and solve issues. And so which means that they're still open to hearing feedback to try and make sure that they get to stage 14 amendment, something that is at least workable for most of the people. Final note on the things coming in the future. In November 2017 was the last major change to all of the regulatory standards, the numerical standards. The Ministry of Environment committed to reviewing standards every 5 years. So that would be November 2022. I'm expecting somewhere around there another potential large change to regulatory standards that's less than 2 years out from where we are right now. So we know we've got a number of changes in the works coming at us. Okay, with that, I will move on to questions.
Okay, first question, we have several.
Excellent.
If a reportable spill occurred before February 1st of 2021 and has been addressed prior to that date, but the report was completed after February 1st, do the new stage 13 rules apply? And
yes.
Is there a new template for reportable spills reported under the stage 13 rules?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the second part of the question first. The stage 13 rules do not speak at all to the mechanism for reporting spills. There is a spill reporting regulation that tells you how to report a spill. It tells you what reports, end of spill, cleanup, the several reports that are required and when they're required. And that has not been affected in any way by the stage 13 amendments. Okay. Regarding whether or not it's a trigger, you could have had a spill in 2005. It was a reportable spill in 2005, and it was cleaned up in 2005. If you did not get a legal instrument between 2005 and now, then it is a Schedule 2 activity, and you will need a legal instrument in the future. Okay, next question.
Can you please explain the difference between a site disclosure statement and a phase 1 environmental site assessment? Does the site disclosure statement trigger the phase 1, or does completing a phase 1 allow for the bypass of the site disclosure statement?
They are two very different things. So a phase 1 is my way as a consultant to find out the history of a site, figure out whether or not you had any Schedule 2 activities on the site, either current or historical, and whether or not there's a potential for contamination. It's a large, robust report that provides you a magnitude of very valuable information. And I would not be able to help somebody fill out a site disclosure statement if I've not done a phase 1 first. And I think it'd be hard to correctly and accurately do a site disclosure statement without having done a phase 1 first. Now, a site disclosure statement is a very, very short form. It simply says, what is the address? What is the PID, the parcel identification number, the legal name, the legal lot name of a parcel? Did it have a Schedule 2 activity? And there's really almost nothing else to it. And so it is not, it does not have all the historical reviews. It's what do you know about the site? And is there a Schedule 2 activity on the site? And so the phase 1 helps inform you so that you can fill out the site disclosure statement accurately, but the phase 1 doesn't trigger a site disclosure statement. It doesn't allow any you can't submit a phase 1 instead of a site disclosure statement. And you theoretically can do a site disclosure statement without doing a phase 1. If you've got a gas station on your property and you know that there's a Schedule 2 activity, you can fill out the site disclosure statement and say, yes, there was a Schedule 2 activity. It's a gas station. There's a specific code in the Schedule 2 as to what to call that, and you don't technically need to do a phase one in order to fill out the site disclosure statement. Okay, next question, please.
What is the expected scope of a phase 2 ESA investigation in the case of a closure of a lab on the 4th floor of a building that otherwise has no other Schedule 2 activities? Is investigation outside the building envelope required?
So what I would do as a consultant is, if I'm absolutely certain there's no source of contamination, I'm going to try and come up with the most logical location to investigate for something, for soil, groundwater. And so I'd probably look at the drainage area, and I'd probably try and put a hole somewhere near a sump or a storm or a sanitary line, something that could have potentially leaked acetone or something, and produce enough data, a very, very limited amount of data, but enough to be able to say, yes, I have met the minimum requirement of a phase one and a phase two, and can say that there isn't contamination and tick that box. Whether or not I do it inside the building envelope or outside the building, if there's a parking lot, it's much easier to drill in a parking lot than inside a building. I would place that location based on what's going to be the most convenient for the client and most cost effective, that I could still say as a professional is an appropriate location to meet the minimum requirements of the regulation. So hopefully it's one hole at somewhere that's not in anybody's way and not expensive to put in, would be my goal. Next question, please.
You referenced the criminal code in your webinar.
Yes.
The criminal code is federal while the CSR is provincial. How does that work?
I have no idea at all. Like I said, I barely even attempted to try and follow it. It's my guess is, and maybe I'm using the wrong term, I'm not a lawyer, that it was a provincial, whatever the provincial equivalent is. I'm really good with how benzene moves in subsurface. How law works is where it's outside of environmental law is not my expertise. So I'm happy to point to the specific references in the Act that point to it. If you give Michelle an email, or if you email me, I can give you a specific link and you can follow it, or ask your legal team to follow it. But yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer that intelligently. Next question, please.
For building permits acting as a trigger for a site disclosure statement, does that include all permit types? For example, single family, interior tenant improvements, etc.
No. So if soil movement isn't occurring, so that interior, you've got a 5-story building and you're doing renovations on the third, doing a complete redo of a third floor, none of that, or even the facade of the entire building, none of that should trigger. It's only if there's going to be potential soil movement. If it is, if you're pouring a new slab, then that probably will trigger. But if everything is above grade, then no, it probably would not. Next question, please. Michelle, any other questions? You're on mute.
Thanks, Todd. This is a question that's a bit of a follow-up to the previous one. It asks, okay, what about staged building permits? Meaning stage one being excavation and shoring, for example, stage 2 being the full building.
So in that kind of staging, we'd probably try and get everything released at the same time and in the same way. The excavation and shoring would probably be the one that triggers, in the building above less so, but it's also going to be somewhat to the interpretation of a specific municipality as far as exactly what's in their permits and the minutia of their permitting process. And every municipality, is a lot of you aware, are ever so slightly different. And so an answer for one municipality may not be exactly the same for everyone, but we'd look to try and release or use the same type release mechanism for all of those. Where you get phasing, as in we're building 1, 2, and 3 now, and in 2 years building 3, 4, 5, and then in 2 years building 6, 7, 8. The ministry doesn't like giving temporary releases for that at all, and will direct you to get an approval in principle prior to starting any of that work as the mechanism for release for the entire project. Next question, please.
You mentioned that the Ministry of the Environment isn't keen on grandfathering. If a site is currently going through the old process, does that mean it's back to square one under the new rules?
It depends on what you mean by and where you are in the old process. So if you've got a legal instrument, that legal instrument is good. If you've got an application in that the ministry simply hasn't gotten to because they are very far behind from what I can tell. I'm waiting on one minor application that's for about the last 8 months. It's been on their list. They will review under the rules that were in place when they receive the application. So if it's just that it's in the works and it's on their desk, then the old rules will still apply. They will review anything based on the rules in effect at the time of receipt of application. If you are, if nothing's actually gone to the ministry, but you've been doing a whole bunch of work, then yeah, you're not starting at square one, but you're now having to operate under the new rules, and that may affect things. So it depends on where exactly you are. And one last scenario: if you've got your permits in place, you've submitted and you've applied and you've gotten your permits, or your applications permits were in under the older rules, then I would think that it would all apply under that. Nobody's going to rescind a building permit you already have in hand and say, oh, the rules changed, so your building permit is no longer valid. If you've got it, you're good. You just will have trouble if you try to get another one. Next question, please.
Can a tenant improvement building permit be held up if the landlord's site is frozen due to a historical Schedule 2 activity?
Yes, dependent on the nature of that landlord tenant improvement permit. If a landlord tenant improvement permit is all interior work, then probably not. If that improvement is, we're going to blow out the east wall and add another 30 feet of commercial space, then absolutely will lock that all up and cause delays. Next question, please.
Okay, I think this question is a follow-up to the relationship between a phase 1 and a site disclosure statement.
Okay.
The participant is asking, is a site disclosure statement not supposed to be filled out to the best of the landowner's knowledge?
Yes, it's meant to be filled out to the best of your knowledge, and it's a gap in the rules that do not necessarily require you to become more knowledgeable. It is to be done to the best of your knowledge. And so if there was some activity, you'd have never done a phase 1 and you don't know about a historical Schedule 2 activity, then you would indicate that there are none and would bypass the rules. That does exist. It will probably come back to bite you sometime later when somebody else figures it out and suddenly it does come up. And I've seen legal proceedings against historical owners for that sort of a thing, because the absence of knowledge doesn't protect you retroactively for remedial costs and such. But there isn't a requirement that I'm aware of for site disclosure statement for you to do a due diligence investigation first. I'm aware that we're approaching 1 o'clock. I'm happy to keep answering questions. So hopefully I'll be able to get most of your questions before I lose too many people. What's the next question?
With reference to the upcoming changes to the CSR in late 2022, if you have an AIP in place, is the project grandfathered as long as it stays within the constraints of the remediation plan associated with the AIP?
No, the AIPs all clearly state on them that when you obtain a certificate of compliance, that you will need to adhere to the regulations in place at the time. And I've tested that on a specific project that overlapped the 2017 change in regulation. And the ministry was very clear that I needed to go back and collect new data for chemicals that were not previously regulated and were under the new rules to make sure that they that they have been now assessed under at the sites. Interestingly, their opinion is that risk assessments, though, will hold. A risk assessment in the AIP will hold even if a regulatory change occurs. But numeric standards, you need to meet the standards at the time when you seek that certificate of compliance. There's not a grandfathering of that aspect, which was highly disappointing to me because I'd really hoped that it would be. Next question.
Once a property has a legal instrument, say an AIP for a building permit in 2021 due to a historical dry cleaner, if there are future triggers, such as a rezoning permit in 2030, would the site disclosure statement now say no Schedule 2 activities exist, provided the new building under the 2021 building permit does not have Schedule 2 activities?
Yeah, so an approval in principle, if you have an approval in principle, the expectation is that you will move it towards a certificate of compliance, usually within a 5-year period. So, so if that's not happening, if you have a site that's an approval in principle and it's never seeking a certificate of compliance, there's a liability issue there, and you're not in compliance with the AIP. So I'm not going to follow that one down the logic, the question, because it's its own whole separate can of worms. And if that's your site, you should give me a call and we should talk it through. If you've got a certificate of compliance for a property and there's no Schedule 2 activities after obtaining that certificate of compliance, then you would be exempted from having to submit a new site disclosure statement based on having a valid certificate of compliance for the property. And so you would not get that certificate of compliance is we're done, we don't need to talk about this property again statement, and that would remain valid. Even if that certificate of compliance was obtained in 2006, it would still be a valid certificate of compliance, and none of the changes would affect your property. Next question.
With regards to the tenant improvement permits for interior only, this participant asks, I have a project which we have a building permit application in December.
Okay, you good.
The District of West Vancouver has not yet provided approvals or updates to the status. Is it possible that there is already a freeze? How would I know as a tenant or as a building permit applicant?
First, if it's in tenant improvement internal, then the freeze process should not affect that. Sometimes municipalities can get confused, especially if some of the newer municipalities that are new to these rules. But that should not cause a freeze, as I understand the regulations. But there are ways to find out if you have a freeze on a property. You can check with the municipality and find out if there's a reason they're not updating you. The other is the site registry can be checked. There are a couple of different ways to do that. Through IMAP, you can actually just see if your property is a free source. You can see if your property is even on a site registry. If your property isn't on the site registry, then you know there isn't a freeze. Otherwise, you can seek the full detailed report from a Ministry of Environment. There's a small fee to get a copy, and that will indicate whether or not there's a freeze on the property that you're dealing with. So there are ways to check that. And anytime we do a phase 1 on a property, it's one of the first things we check is whether or not what the regulatory status of that property is. Next question.
Final question. We've had several people ask this question actually. Will the participants get a recording of this presentation?
I think that we are going to try and do that. I would like to at least have one posted on our website. So I'm gonna work with Rui to see if we can make that happen.
Excellent. Okay, that's all of the questions.
Okay, excellent, perfect. So didn't only 1 minute or two over. Well, I thank everybody very much for their time attending this presentation. And I am happy to answer any follow-up questions. My contact information has been up on the screen for a while, so hopefully everyone knows how to reach out to me. Please, if there are any follow-up questions or you'd like to understand any specifics more, please reach out and I'm happy to discuss it in greater detail. Thank you.